Provocateur.media.
I think one of the things that he was offering was really simple solutions. So he was saying, look guys, whatever harm you're experiencing, whatever problems you have in your life, oh boy, have I got a really simple solution for you.
The Goldwaters is brought to you by Goldwater Dubé, shaping the history of Canadian family law since 1981.
The Goldwaters vous est présenté par Goldwater Dubé, modeler l'histoire du droit familial canadien depuis 1981.
Welcome to another edition of the Goldwaters. Today's episode is all about racism in America. Guys, let's start by talking about the results in America. How important a role do you think racism played in the Trump victory, if at all? Some people argue that it didn't play a role.
I, for one, think that it was a significant contributor. I think that there are parts of the United States, there are communities, there are people who are feeling increasingly marginalized as white Christians and who are afraid of being overrun by all the brown and black and yellow and red people. I think there are people who are frightened that there are more Latino babies born in California than white babies, and the fact that whites themselves will be a minority within about 20 years. And I think that Trump spoke to those people. Far be it from me to mention at this time his origins in the Vaterland, Germany. I'm a Jew, I can't help it. And so fits into my image of him, but would never have occurred to me had he not spoken a message that horrified so many people, but that attracted others like flies to honey. I would like to think that in modernity, the minute somebody expresses a strong opprobrium to people of other religions, of other colors, I'd like to think that people who express opprobrium towards half the human race, the female half, I would think that those would be automatic disqualifications for any office, including dog catcher. As we learned, there was that municipal representative in small town in Nowheresville, United States, who commented that, yay, Melania is going to be in the White House, and thank God that Michelle is out because she looks like an ape in heels.
That was actually the mayor of a town in Pennsylvania.
It wasn't the mayor who spoke.
Oh.
It was another person who held some minor office in the town, village, or cave that these people lived in, who made the comment to the mayor, and the mayor went, hoorah! And it was two women speaking.
Okay, it was a retweet, essentially.
It was a retweet, okay. So it was a communication between two women viciously attacking another woman, who is still the First Lady of the United States. And it's a reminder to us that sexism and racism don't just come from dispossessed white Christian men, right? It can be repeated and retweeted even by members of the groups who are being attacked. But that being said, for me, it was a big contribution to the electoral campaign. It demonstrated something that no civilized human being could have expected, which is that if you speak ill of people by reason of race and creed and religion and skin color and sexual orientation and sex tout court, you become extra popular. You know, I've been thinking of going into politics, and I know how to do it now. Like, I've got the recipe down pat now. Attack as viciously as possible anybody you can who's not in your direct voter base, and that's going to make you popular and respected and esteemed.
I think racism evidently played a role in the election. And I think his courtship of the alt-right and of the near synonymous neo-Nazis, and without while being pretty hesitant to directly denounce their backing of him, I think racism clearly played a role. That said, the thing I find that I think it was frankly more insidious for most people. I think that you may say that there's some people that fall in the basket of deplorables that are, let's say, the ones that are racist and sexist and really buy in, full-throated into what he has to say. But then I think there's a big group of people that frankly thought it was irrelevant, that thought it didn't matter, which is maybe worse, comes into sort of the bystander, that they just saw that, well, maybe he's saying these horrible sexist things and he's saying these things that are racist and anti-immigrant and are offensive, and I don't like them, but, I think he could still do a good job. And I think it's the rest of the stuff he's still saying is fine, and these things aren't deal breakers. So even if I don't agree with it, then, who cares? No big deal. And I think the other thing that Trump was really selling on, which sort of falls into, I think a lot of people that may not self-identify as, I think frankly most people, whether they're racist or not, don't self-identify as racist. I think one of the things that he was offering was really simple solutions. So he was saying, look guys, whatever harm you're experiencing, whatever problems you have in your life, oh boy, have I got a really simple solution for you. Let's find the groups that are easy to identify, that are a different color or a different gender. It's their fault. And you know what? I'm going to do something great. I'm going to target them, and we're going to fix everything. And I think these things tend to sell. The same as with, pit bull bans. If you could say, hey, whatever problems you're experiencing, let's say with dog aggression, it's because of a supposedly easily identifiable group, and I'll just target that group. It's an easy sell.
Okay, hold on. Before you get on, Daniel, this makes it double, triple, quadruple racism, because it makes it racism with an interest. It doesn't just mean I happen to think Group X are funny looking, or Group X don't like the same music we do, and we don't like their music, their culture, their look, their feel, their taste, how they spell their name. It means it's now racism with an interest. Because had you said to me, and I thought that's what you were going to say, that racism wasn't a deal breaker with Trump because people were so anxious to vote this guy in who had clear and resonant policies that would be a relief to these
policies?
people. That's the point. And he said, I don't believe in the Affordable Care Act, and here's the type of statutory provisions that I'm going to bring into law, and here's how we're going to fund them. Or if he had policies, here are the ways in which, here are the infrastructure programs or educational programs that I'm going to finance out of the public budget in order to put people back to work. Because, of course, in such a scenario, he'd be telling ordinary people they're gone. It's technology that's put those jobs out of existence, and they're just not coming back unless we go back to living in caves.
As a side note, which makes it extra fun, the added funny element, not funny element of it, is that you have, it's interesting to me that you have whatever business owners, that they decide that they have a bunch of manual labor work to do. They want to pay as little as possible. And so they hire people that are, let's say, illegal immigrants and have less choice and have less freedom, and are, more desperate to accept these jobs. They pay it to them, and then let's say the white Christian, blue collar workers who don't get those jobs because they want more pay, will then blame the people that are disenfranchised instead of blaming the business owners who are hiring them and who want to, because they are looking to pay as little as humanly possible.
But when we come back to that, again, those manual labor jobs are disappearing. Even the agricultural
but
jobs
you guys are debating immigration policy right
but I'm
now.
not,
The question
not
was
finished.
very clear, and I don't know if you've really answered it.
That's what I'm coming to. These are people who are choosing a candidate who's espousing racist ideas. He's not an idea man. I don't believe he knows what the word ideology means. Remember, we're talking man who absolutely does not read books, newspapers, or magazines. His sensory input comes from television screens. That's all he knows.
Bigly.
Bigly. So he enunciates no policies, but speaks to people, just as you said, Samantha, to blame people of color, to blame the elites, to blame anybody who doesn't look or smell like he does. And say that this is the magic by targeting these people. And, once you target people, you dehumanize them that way. Once you talk about having these registries of people and these mass deportations and loading people on cattle cars and putting them in internment camps because, you can't deport them on the moment, right?
And the
You know, it
worst is that
doesn't
he's
go
saying,
far-
and the worst is he's saying that the precedent is the Japanese. Right?
Yeah, that was
Great.
awesome. That
Oh,
was the
even
great
better.
precedent.
Right.
The Japanese. Why didn't he just go back to the Germans? That's the best precedent of all. I'm sure there's a lot of cattle cars in museums that he could use to deport all these millions of people. He has no conception in his pea-sized brain
are you
what
done?
it means. No, what it means to say you're going to deport 11 million people.
He's gone it down to 2-3 million now. But yes, Daniel.
If you're going to say that racism is prevalent as it was in this campaign, you also have to explain why did so many hundreds of thousands of people who voted for Obama previously voted for Trump. There's a whole swath of people that you're going to have a lot of trouble accusing of racism. Secondly, I don't know why you choose to focus on the word racism, which is much more of a damaging label for anybody to wield in a debate. Makes for a more fun debate, when words like nativist or populist are actually just more appropriate to what Trump was selling. The fact that there was racist rhetoric in his campaign that was unprecedented in modern American politics is evident, okay? If you want to denounce it, go right ahead. I'll denounce it too. But if you want to say that really it was racism was the pith and substance of the campaign, I really think that's an exaggeration. I think you're at 1 to 5%, I would assume, for the sake of just making an estimate of people who supported him were real racists, like white supremacists, true racists. There's a lot of people who are sympathetic to the policies on immigration, and this is an old simmering issue in America and in Republican politics that isn't necessarily as racist or as white supremacist as you're making it out to be. Like Samantha just corrected you, added, I don't want to say corrected you knew this as well. He softened his position right now to getting rid of criminals. It seems like throughout the whole time, even his supporters said they knew he wasn't going to go through on full deportation. Most Americans, even like 65%, so a big swath of Republicans, are against full outright deportation of illegals. He's probably just going to end up, we'll see, we'll keep him accountable, hold on. He's deporting these people who are criminals right now of the illegal set, which was also policy under Obama for 8 years.
This is what is hallucinatory in what you're saying. First of all, the fact that he spoke to the people who are interested in racist policies and got their vote is part of what carried the tide of the election. And what's more frightening is the number of people for whom, as Samantha indicated, they're not directly racist, they think to themselves, but for whom expressions of deep and abiding racist thought, vicious racism in fact, just not a deal breaker.
Did you know that the American Communist Party endorsed Bernie Sanders? Bernie Sanders did not make any statement against their endorsement. He did not denounce their endorsement.
But Bernie Sanders is a communist. What do you have a problem with me for?
Okay,
Would I be voting for Bernie Sanders?
My point to you is that
you're talking to the wrong person. You're forgetting how right-wing your mother is.
Right-wing for Canada.
Well, yeah, right-wing for Canada.
No, my
It's probably communist in the United
Communist
States.
I'm just
say
talking
so.
for just a bit of
But
precision,
can
a
we
bit of
stick on-
intellectual.
but let's- I have the intellectual.
Well, no, just to be a bit more
precision,
surgical
Daniel,
about this. When you start saying
I'm
that
not
they're all
trying,
racist and the
but we're
immigration
not
policies
talking
are
about
racist.
Bernie Sanders.
No, we're
not
talking about
him.
we're talking about racism in the Trump election.
That would
we
have been a
just
more
witnessed.
frightening race. That would have been a frightening race between out-and-out communism and out-and-out fascism. Then I'd move to the other side of the planet, Australia.
when you call
where
it
are you?
out-and-out
Can we come back
fascism,
to the
you're-
racism?
But
Can we
don't
come
you
back to the
understand? It's
racism?
like the fascism actually was a real dictatorship in history that killed millions of people. Just to say that Trump is fascist.
Can we
is
come back to
complete
another
corruption
big-
of the expression?
another plank of his platform, such as it was, that was, of course, void of any actual policy or descriptions of things that he would actually do. He just did that thing that he does on television all the time, which is, I think, to most mental health professionals, symptomatic of a number of disorders. You know, we could take the DSM, the Diagnostic and Standard Manual of Psychologists, and we would take half the book and describe it to him. His narcissism, his lack of empathy, his grandiosity. He just says he would do things that were unspecified that will make America great. And the truth is, and the problem is, and maybe then I might adhere to Samantha's point, that there might be a point in saying it's not that these people who voted for him are racist, but that the quality of public education in the United States has declined so drastically that ordinary people who are called upon to vote once every 4 years simply do not have enough education. It's nothing to do
so
with the
now they're not
IQ they're
racist,
born
they're
with.
stupid
They
now.
don't. I didn't. I quite. I came
Well,
in
no,
with
you're
that
saying
right
they're not
away.
educated.
It's not.
Educated.
They don't have the education to have a sense of critical thought,
Except-
and to not buy in to the snake oil being sold by this con man.
except that the
white
average-
college-educated
Yeah.
people, he won more than Clinton, so that your point
Yes.
is lost.
I would hearken to Samantha, who, as a doctoral student, had to correct the papers of undergrads and used to comment to me regularly about how most of the undergrads were absolutely functionally illiterate. And that the degree of corrections that she had to do on these papers for undergraduate students here in Canada, where we think we're educated,
in a
were frightening.
unilingual English province.
Yeah, not even in Quebec, where Anglophones are completely illiterate, eh? We can come back to the genocide of the English in another
So you think people are
podcast.
less educated today than they were, less intelligent, less media savvy?
Yes, it's part of the public discourse.
I don't
that we recognize that the public, whatever that means, whoever they are, we're part of them, are less educated today than they were 50 years ago.
I don't think that it's just I don't ascribe to that personally. I don't. I think that's a different debate. I don't think that it's necessarily the uneducated that accounts for a Trump victory, and I don't think it's necessarily the racists that account for a Trump victory. And there's many factors that accounted for a Trump victory. I think one of them, in terms of racism, is frankly that for the thing that I find more disturbing is that a lot of people just wasn't a deal breaker. That they thought he could do a good job anyways. So a lot of people voted for him. My impression is a lot of people voted for him despite his
But what were
racist
they
and
voting
misogynist.
for?
They were voting for change. I think that he was riding, and it's maybe a bit controversial. I think he was riding on the same wave that frankly Obama did. Faith in politics has been at an all-time low for quite a while, and the politicians that promise the most change are the ones that are really getting more votes. So you have Obama, then you have the popularity of Bernie Sanders, which was unprecedented as well. People are looking for dramatic change because they don't trust the political institutions that are there. Hillary, one of the biggest issues, I think at least with her, was that she was looking for her policy. She was presented as the establishment. And her policies were about incremental, wee little teeny changes that eventually will add up to something maybe possibly meaningful. And people were just not in the mood for that. And so with Trump, where he's saying, hey, dudes, don't worry about it. I'm just going to do some stuff. It's going to be a lot of stuff. It's going to be totally different, you guys. And I'm not an establishment guy. And it's going to be great, bigly. They're like, okay, sure. Oh, he happens to say some racist and sexist stuff. That sucks, but he'll still be fine.
But to add to your point, you also hold on. No, my turn to talk. You also have to give him a bit of credit here in that you were going on before admonishing Trump for having no policies. Okay. The reality is, I think most people would have difficulty enunciating the policy points of Hillary Clinton. If you go back on it, really what she was talking about, what Samantha just described, was a certain incrementalism, which is fine. I think that's good policy. Don't get me wrong. I don't think that's wrong-headed. But my point is that he was able to more full-throatedly articulate what his policy points were. They're very simple, very blunt, but you could say them on 5 points. Any person in America could articulate.
Repeal Obamacare.
Build a wall.
Build a wall.
Make Mexico pay for it.
Already you're
Repeal NAFTA.
So there you go.
Refuse to sign TPP because he doesn't like China. Not a signatory of the TPP.
And a big, and big infrastructure
Support Putin and Assad's regime to bomb the shit out of civilians in Syria. Take in no Syrians. Oh, I got his points.
So you're
down.
great at it. So you just don't
I'm
agree with
great
the
at
policy
it,
points.
I
Don't
was
say
take-
they're not policy. You don't like the policy. That's okay. I don't like a lot of policies either, but don't say it's not policy.
And that's what takes me from Samantha's point right to you, because Samantha says that what he articulated was change. And what you're pointing out, perhaps correctly, because of course nobody wants to talk about the fact that Barack Obama, a weak president if there ever was one, in fact deported Latinos by the truckload. He
Part of that is they may have been
millions.
changing definitions in terms of how those were counted, and that's a whole different story.
It doesn't change the fact that Daniel's point that many have supported in the American discourse is that now Trump's quoted softer position, not the one he promised when he lied to the hillbillies who believed him, but the fact
the
is
college
that when
educated that believed him.
they're still hillbillies.
Hold on,
But let me finish
the
the
hillbillies,
sentence.
the stupids, the racists. It's like
The college-educated hillbillies who believe him. Change. We're gonna have change. We're gonna deport tens of millions of people. Let's deport them all. 2 seconds after he's elected, he says, "Well, we're only going to deport exactly the same category of people that Barack Obama deported." And I sit there and I go, I didn't like when Stephen Harper deported Latinos too. I thought it was disgusting. I hate it. I voted for Stephen Harper. I voted for the man.
Because it wasn't important enough to you that he was targeting minorities?
Because he didn't indicate at the time that he was going to, let's take this all the way around. Maybe I'm going to be the hillbilly at the end of my own sentence, and I'll tell you why. Because not only was it not part of his platform at the time, but when he started, and to say that he was going to tighten up our refugee program was certainly required, because people were, as a lawyer who's had some of these clients, the abuses of our refugee program were certainly known to all. But he ended up making it almost impossible for anybody to come into the country, including notably Mexicans.
Didn't your husband get in on the refugee program?
From El Salvador, many years ago, under another regime, and I think a conservative regime.
We should really tighten that refugee program. It was with a lovely plate of food that he's prepared for us right here, and he's taking care of the dogs, and he's helping to support everything that we're doing right now. But we should really tighten that refugee program, because just anyone can get in.
By the way, the refugee program that brought him in was in fact terrible, and I'm going to tell you that, because the very people that he calls terrorists from his country, and that he knew personally to be terrorists, have been allowed into this country and live here now under that refugee program, because we were too stupid even then. And now I'm going to sound like a Trump supporter, right? We were too stupid even then to make the distinction between real refugees like Lionel, who had never been terrorists, who had never engaged, and I mean terrorists in Anne France's definition, asymmetrical warfare, targeting of civilians, not targeting of military targets or soldiers. So the legitimate refugees like he were allowed in, but many of the most notorious terrorists from El Salvador during that civil war, who have the blood of civilians on their hands, were allowed into this country and live here. Now it's an embarrassment to our country. Now we can close the parenthesis.
And we have such problems with guerrilla warfare from socialists in Canada. I mean, really.
So in fact, the point that you're making, Daniel, were we to generalize it across North America, is to realize that the college-educated hillbillies who voted for change are absolutely right. It doesn't matter what politician you vote into power, Obama, Clinton, Trump, Harper, or Trudeau. They're all going to have anti-brown immigration policies, because that's what flies in today's pro-white political environment.
Let's bring it back to America, and at least there's some base in the Trump supporters that are expressing, of course, racist sentiment. Let's bring that back to sort of the economic conditions we were talking about earlier. Is that breeding sort of this more tribal racism atmosphere in American politics, and have we seen this before, perhaps, in world history?
This is a world movement that's going on right now. I know that we like to see this as just the states and what happened to them, and this is so unexpected, and where did this come from? But this has been going on in Europe already for many years now. Everything's been swinging pretty far white and pretty far nationalist. It's really deeply disturbing and scary. And we could say that maybe it's the global financial crisis in 2008 that sort of spurred some of these things. Frankly, it's hard to tell. It's also terrifying. I think you can also start playing into the role of the Middle East and of terrorism, and really the media glorification of the terrorist acts that have occurred. So there's really this culture of economic uncertainty, and then this constantly playing on a loop on TV. This there's brown people, there's terrorists. They're going to come and blow you up at any minute. We're far greater risk of dying from secondhand smoke and from dying in a car accident while we're driving our kids to school. But oh my God, there's this global emergency of terrorism from brown people that we have to really worry about. And I think that frankly, that's all feeding into this nationalist fervor that's sort of taking over the world. And it's when I start to really think about it, I start to, my mind starts to go to really dark places, and I start to get into history is cyclical, and now we're sort of winding into a third world war. And then I just try to remove myself from it, read a little bit less news, and start, going on a mantra of compassion, and people do the best that they can.
There's no question we're not living in the world of 1967 Expo, Man in His World, and I'd like to teach the world to sing, right? But that was a period of unprecedented economic expansion in the world. In addition, there was the agricultural revolution that it's also started, I think, in 1965. And there's been a huge decline in hunger in the world that continues to persist to this day and continues to improve. And I would have thought that when you looked at economic conditions globally, away from whether, the wealthy stockbroker's wife on Long Island has to give up her Filipino housekeeper. But if you looked at it from the perspective globally and how many people have enough food to eat and how many people have access to reliable birth control on the earth, you would think that global conditions had improved so enormously that there would be less of that pressure to foment racist thought, or as Daniel likes to call it, nativist thinking. Isn't that what you call it? Nativist? It all comes down to blood and soil, eh?
Yeah, fine. If you want to use a more derisive term, you would say populist. But I think that I agree with Samantha that, look, it's multifactorial. I think the economic crisis, of course, plays a huge role. I think it was really a crisis of capitalism. I see it, not to get too academic, but I'm still somewhat a Marxist, and I do see this this privatization of the gains and socializations of the losses in the economic crisis that we just witnessed was a huge blow to the very spirit of capitalism.
The average salary of the Trump supporter is $72,000 a year.
That's not the point. The ideas are more infectious.
The economic crisis?
But the ideas are infectious. The notion of unfairness in an economic system that is rigged is the perception. You don't have to be wealthy or poor to believe that. There's plenty of evidence to see that. And when we think of Brexit, also in Europe, they had the whole thing with the Grexit as well, before Brexit, right? That's kind of what precipitated the whole thing. These people who right now are having to socialize some losses and other people who are not themselves getting gains as part of globalization. This is part of the trend that we're seeing.
You remember the Occupy movement?
So there you go. And this is what I mean about the heightening of contradictions. The fact that even you had a guy like Bernie positing, saying socialism and identifying as a socialist without being ran out of town is absolutely shocking. I also think something has gone unmentioned. It's not just these economic conditions. It's also the atomization of media consumption. I think that there was once a time when you would have the evening news, you'd have literally 20 to 30 million people watching Walter Cronkite, saying that's just the way it is, right? Here's the news, straight. The overall trend that I'm describing, which is literally like a tenfold decrease in viewing the same anchor deliver the same news, that's a reality. That's what you've been seeing, that's what you've been witnessing, and that's what we just saw in this election play out. Two different Americas consuming completely different things that know nothing about each other, and we're all guilty of it. Everybody who's listening to this, everybody who is here at this table, we're all guilty of it. We all consume the echo chamber. We all do. We all do.
Whoa. I always thought the brilliance of modernity, speaking as an older person, I thought the brilliance of modernity is that you had access to more dissemination of news and you had a richer range of observations and opinions. La Presse may not have a written edition anymore, another aspect of modernity, but in the day, we always had in this house, when you were growing up, the Globe and Mail, the National Post, the Gazette, and before that the Montreal Star, of course, and Le Devoir and La Presse, and on Sunday, the Sunday New York Times. So, there's no question. We're used to that in Quebec. I think we may be unique in North America, because if you read English and French news here in Quebec, which is an itsy-bitsy, teeny-tiny province of 8 million people, you realize the news as written in La Presse or Le Devoir or Journal de Montréal is completely different from the news reported in the Gazette, the Globe and Mail, or the National Post. And I've always thought it was important to read them all together to get a full picture. So I think that what's missing is critical thinking, the faculty of critical thinking.
There's critical thinking, and there's knowing how to find what are good sources, because as well as I do with the search algorithms and with where people mostly consume their news at this point, which is like Facebook and Twitter, that it does create an echo chamber. It does put people in a bubble. Now, I think it would be very useful, as something to build on, instead of maybe backing off in terms of name calling either side, no matter how appropriate it may seem to each of us, and really start to build on, instead of accusing everyone of being uneducated, to really start to build on critical thinking skills, to be able to have encourage more of the aggregate news, exploring aggregate news sites. What are reasonable sources? How can you tell? How to look things up? Those things are all effortful for people to do, so it's a hard sell. But maybe these are things that we need to really think seriously and hard about, so at least we're all basing ourselves on a similar bunch of information and on facts if we can.
Well, my concern, in fact, transcends the racism, which is, I mean, what we're really talking about is this worrisome trend that you can denigrate races or you can denigrate women, and we can conflate racism and sexism, and it doesn't disqualify someone from the highest office in the land, and in fact the most important office in the world. But I would take it even one step further. I think that unless we think a lot more carefully about how we're going to reform civic education and the duty of citizens to participate in the democratic process, keeping in mind that
elections almost, at each level of government,
it's about 45% of the American electorate who couldn't even be bothered to get up and vote in an election as dramatic as this one. Speaks to a tremendous disengagement from democracy. And you're certainly not going to solve the problems of racism and discrimination if people can't even be bothered to get up and vote. You may think that I'm engaging in name calling if I characterize some of the people who voted for Trump as being hillbillies. I'm just as frustrated and outraged that the black community only cared to make this effort to get up and vote.
Oh my goodness. They are the demographic that voted least for Trump. If you're going to start pointing at the blacks
come
for
out
a
in
Trump
the
victory,
same numbers.
seriously.
What about white women? I don't like this idea of going through who voted, finding the demographic you don't like.
Latinos, Cubans in Florida came out and voted for Trump. Where's the allegiance amongst Latinos to say we don't need somebody who's a Latino basher, who hates Latinos, who has anti-immigration policies, and yet Latinos, notably Cubans, but many other Latinos as well, who voted for him. I find it, when you talk about atomization, I'm wondering about the sense of loyalty within communities
when
they hear racist diatribes, or about women also who hear sexist diatribes and say, hey, let's go vote for the pussy grabber. So I think that the important thing are the lessons in civic education that we're going to give to young people, so we start raising people who are more interested in voting and not do what the Germans did to themselves, which is democratically vote Adolf Hitler into power.
Among the 18 to 25-year-old cohort, they voted overwhelmingly for Clinton. Just as a side note.
Young people always vote liberal. I don't know why that's such a happy observation. They turn out to be selfish baby boomers, and what's the big deal? They're going to turn out to be selfish conservatives in 15 years? Who cares?
You look at your wristwatch to do that, eh? I'd rather view it as optimistically as Samantha did. Yay for the babies, not the baby boomers. The babies are the baby boomers.
So part of what I want to do in the podcast today is take a look back on the last 8 years of the Obama presidency, take a look at the progress that has been made for racial harmony in America. It started out with a lot of hope and change, and how's that worked out for America?
Well, I don't think that America is more harmonious racially. I think that part of what was exciting for a lot of Americans about Obama was, and his election was the thought that this would herald a post-racial world. And in fact, the Supreme Court then afterwards, in overturning voter rights supervision for various of the red states, that a history of racial discrimination in 2013 in Shelby v. Holder, also believed that we were effectively, their ruling suggested we were in, we got Obama, we're in a post-racial world, we don't need supervision of states and voting anymore, we got this. And as the Black Lives Movement has really brought into focus, no, we're not. Surprise, surprise, racism is still here, even with a black president. And so if we're asking, has Obama made a change? Has he brought about a more racially harmonious America? I don't think so. That said, I think in having a black president, and I think particularly towards the end of his presidency, as he started to speak much more openly and directly about issues of black rights and about and racial injustice in the States, I think he's really helped to open the dialogue. And frankly, when we start to open our eyes and we start to really see what the problem is, I think that's an extremely important step to take. And we can't have the hope of a more racially harmonious future without first recognizing the ugliness that is present now. And I think that Obama was instrumental in that, or was helpful at that.
In other words, he accomplished absolutely nothing. The one thing the man accomplished was getting elected, which was huge, which was cathartic. You know, and I joined many other friends, including my partner, who's part Haitian, part French Canadian, in then crying with joy that of all people, the Americans, despite their dark underbelly of racism, despite what appeared to be huge swaths of the population that really adhere to white supremacist values, whether these people recognize it or not, this people, in a democratic process, threw up a black leader. They brought this very wonderful and very educated man into the White House. And I was so glad for them for that. And I believed, like everybody else, he was symbolic of hope and change. And certainly, it had to be President Barack Obama who could say, after the tragic circumstances of the death of Trayvon Martin, that Trayvon Martin could have been my son. That statement alone is very important for the national psyche of the American people, very important for black citizens of the United States to feel like citizens, perhaps for the first times in their lives and the lives of all their ancestors before them, to feel like complete citizens. But let me finish that. But during his actual presidency, I cannot help but notice that nobody, certainly no white police officer, and I say that as a fan of the police. Remember, I'm an attorney. I believe in law and order. I believe in the police force. I'm on that side of the equation. I don't feel that police officers, when they're looking at a young man walking down the street or driving in his car, have somehow internalized the thought, well, that fellow is a random, respectable black fellow who could tomorrow perhaps be president of the United States, like our current president. Because if they internalized that thought, you wouldn't have these constant killings that are so painful for the Canadian soul. I don't know what they do to destroy the American soul, but we're their close neighbors and brothers and sisters, and every time I see these videos, and I have perspective, and I understand that sometimes these are very conflictual interactions between citizens and police officers. But these are interaction after interactions where men, sometimes women, but men, black men, are being shot dead in the street. And there is no crime you commit that gives a police officer the right to kill you in cold blood in the street, unless you directly have a loaded gun with the trigger about to be pulled against the head of another human being. Okay. We have a legal system. You have even a murderer, a cold-blooded murderer himself, is entitled to be arrested, to hear his Miranda rights, as it's called in the States, although we have the same thing here, to be brought before a jury of his peers and tried. And that's what these police officers are taking away.
Okay, I just want to jump in here. I think, so both of you are agreeing that the fact of a black president is an achievement in and of itself. I mean, I agree.
100%.
Sure, that's fine. It's a very basic observation. Doesn't really
basic observation, and an awesome and merit-worthy candidate.
Yeah, he has a silver tongue. That's all very good.
No,
Mind you, hold on. You had your turn.
He's the adult in the room.
Okay, we should hope that politicians who run for the office of the presidency are adults, and it's not. That should not be
always the case.
The question is, what has he achieved for minorities in America? Now, we always talk about the black president. Part of his campaign was actually being biracial. He had a white mother.
Yes.
Part of what he was campaigning about, part of what he actually executed, was to have a national conversation between whites and blacks. Right? He was trying to approach the subject as being, look, I have a foot in both camps. And when he said that very eloquently, it was definitely moving, it affected me, when he said that Trayvon Martin could have been my son. It's a powerful, moving thing to say, but it also begs the question, my son will not look like Trayvon Martin. Well, it's unlikely he will. And it does start to focus the discussion on identity politics. It makes the conversation have a higher volume, but there's still... I question the wisdom of inserting these identity politics into America and what it has actually achieved, and whether or not there has been a reaction to that. I think we've been mired in identity politics for during Obama's two administrations. I think that it's kind of reached a fever pitch. whether it's Black Lives Matter or whether it's a lot of things that social conservatives have get up in arms about, whether it's also the trans movement, which you could say is a parallel thing, but I think it actually flows from the fact that we had a black president, made us focus on identity issues and minority issues. If you think about the Oscars So White movement, we are more attuned to these things than we ever have been before. Safe spaces and all this stuff, and it becomes fodder for conservatives to make fun of and to say that this...
Conservatives have a huge amount of chutzpah to complain about identity politics when they have become, I don't know when, and I don't know how, but a gang of white supremacists. For instance, you'll notice in the electoral campaign, Donald Trump was able to say anything he wanted about blacks, about the disabled, about Latinos. He could say anything and he could get away with it.
And this is because there was a reactionary white population in the States that was reacting to Obama's policies.
The only time he was stopped was when it came out that he was sexually assaulting super race white women, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, white chicks.
Well, he would never go for anything else.
Who belong to some random white man. Because that suddenly became the discourse where he started to become really delegitimized.
And frankly, that's the difference between what was happening what was happening more recently with Trump and and his boasting about sexual assault and Anita Hill, is that now we have, instead of having a pretty young black woman, an educated, pretty young black woman like Anita Hill, who's bringing forward allegations of sexual assault, we now have, pretty young blonde girls who are white, and all of a sudden it just, now American people really want to listen.
They're more than white and Aryan and super race, right? Übermenschen, as we call the super race in the original German. But in addition, they belong to white men.
Not all of them, no.
That was the principal comment. The Republicans who started to disavow him, a group of white people, if ever you saw a group, with the one exception of the tinted fellow there, Ben Carson, who passes for uber white. But all the rest of them were white Republican Christian men who were talking about their wives, their daughters, and their sisters. No independent existence of the women qua women. And no reference again. These are the same people who expressed no concern with the way he tortured Alicia Machado. If you'll remember the Miss Universe, the former Miss Venezuela, who was Latina. And she could be attacked as viciously as viciously as by a complete psychotic. Somebody who clearly doesn't sleep, which might explain why he sniffs all the time during the debates. You know who are the people who never sleep and are tweeting at 3 and 5 in the morning?
This is derailing into a discussion about Trump. This is about Barack Obama and what he's achieved for minorities in America. That's what discussion's about. Focus on that. Because right now,
so if you rail it back, if you bring it back into Barack Obama, the whole point is to see who his opposition is, and for his opposition, because your point was these social conservatives, these white and white-bread Republicans who are complaining about identity politics, are the ones who played it as cruelly and viciously, literally to the point of the threat of civil war, right? The threat of revolution, the threat of starting revolution after the election. That was the threat. I watched these hillbillies go, and that's what they were threatening, if not promising us.
This is a cult of personality. We're not talking about
we've gone through in Quebec. We've gone through in Quebec a huge crisis of identity politics during our own electoral campaign.
It's been horrible and wrenching.
I fought the whole time, and I was up attacking our local ethnic nationalist separatist party. I lived it here, and I couldn't believe it was happening in modernity, that divisions could be created in society by reason of identity, thereby leading to your expression identity politics. What I would like to believe, and I hope you're conflating improperly, is there's a big difference where identity is appropriated for political attack and political advantage, as we lived here before the presidential campaign, and as our neighbors to the south just went through, and just plain old identity, which is awesome to affirm, which is a wonderful and beautiful thing to affirm. You brought up the trans movement.
Unless there's riots that go on in cities across America because Black Lives Matter is the leading ideology that a lot of people subscribe to, which I think stands on some iffy empirical ground, I'd like to put out there.
I would agree with you if you go there, but not the words themselves.
Hold on.
But not the words themselves. I want to dissociate us from the movement with which I disagree, the Black Lives Matter. Which
but arguably that's something that flowed out of the Obama years, the zeitgeist.
I don't agree. I'm not blaming. I don't don't agree that it's legitimate to blame
Well, think
Obama
about it,
or
no.
his administration or his identity for that, because then you delegitimize him as a black leader.
Who's blaming?
But the concept that black lives do matter is one that has to touch us all.
Yeah, but there's an agenda. Dude, it's a slogan. It's compelling because it's made to be compelling. It's marketing. It's PR, and there are elements like you just
Don't
admitted.
banalize it, but don't banalize
well,
it by
hold on,
calling
but
it nothing more than a marketing
when police
slogan. Now
officers-
that's not fair.
No, slow down. But when the reaction is you have Walmarts being raided, you have police officers getting bricks in the face now in Charlotte. Well, recently in Charlotte. Before any evidence has come to weigh in on what these police actually did, and police are being vilified across the United States for based on flimsy evidence and videos that go viral, and there's a rapacious mob that wants to accept these things because it does feed into liberal sort of snootiness. You want to...
Can we just, okay, pause, big pause right here. First of all, can Obama be blamed for Black Lives Matter movement? I think maybe he can partly take credit for it, if you're going to say blame, because at least having a black president does open some of the dialogue, and he's brought, especially towards the end of his presidency, has brought some of these issues to the forefront. In terms of the relationship with Zionism, let's save that, or anti-Zionism, let's save that for another time, because frankly, I think it's a red herring. We're talking about Obama and about black Americans. So we can talk about that another time.
Samantha, there's two ways you can try to combat racism in a society. One is through the state, one is through soft power, like cultural change. And they're different issues, they're different battlefields. And I don't know...
There's no overlap.
About the president. Hey,
that's my point. Point me in the direction of the statute that needs to change. You're the attorney, think like a jurist.
That's the point.
Well,
it would have
is it?
been up to President Obama, who missed opportunity after opportunity to get down to the real issue, which is not judging, condemning, or gauging the behavior of ordinary citizens engaging or good and bad behavior when they're intercepted by the police, because whether you're a hoodlum or a fine upstanding citizen, you are entirely free to have good or bad behavior. The issue is the behavior of the police officers. And were I would have called for a national task force to look into the issue of educating police forces across the land, or providing funds for education to give police officers from the smallest communities to the largest urban centers greater training, not only in terms of being more aware of dealing with other racial groups, because there's more than black minority members that police officers have to deal with, who may have reactions that we don't expect because they come from different cultural communities in different countries. But in addition, to have, in general, proper training in terms of de-escalation, proper training as to how serious it is, how serious a situation you must be in before you're entitled to draw your firearm.
You make it seem like they're all trigger happy. Ask any police officer.
Far
listen
from
to
being.
me.
No,
the last thing they want to do is draw their gun.
And
the last thing a police officer wants to do.
And the last thing I believe is that a police officer wants to draw his gun. I don't believe that at all. I'm an attorney. When I was young, I did a fair bit of criminal law. I got to meet a lot of police officers whom I tended to find almost uniformly to be excessively cute and adorable. But maybe I'm lucky, because in this community, we don't seem to be as plagued with police aggression as perhaps other communities might experience. So I don't come in with any bias, because I've enjoyed police company. Heck, I got more clients acquitted by being sweet and cute with police officers and getting them to tell me the whole scoop on their case, and then using it in the courtroom, until one adorable French-Canadian lieutenant from the NDG station said to me one day, Metro Goldwater, I think when you're being nice to me, you're trying to get information out of me. I said, well, I never identified myself as a Crown prosecutor. I have not lied to you. It was very adorable, Sergeant Detective Aubin. So that being said, I've always thought it important to have a good relationship with the police officers in your community. And I feel deeply sad for this absolute social reality that in many communities, people of color do not feel that they can develop that type of positive and interactive relationship with the police officers policing their community.
And I don't know how much Black Lives Matter helps. Go to their website. Hold on. They think that there is a genocide. They write the word genocide by police officers.
Do I strike you as the type of fool that buys into that movement? I told you, I didn't have to go further to see their endorsement. Israel, apartheid state.
Again, that is
Thank you. I know where we're going. for me, there are buzzwords for crazy, and that's one of the buzzwords for crazy. It doesn't change the fact that ordinary people do not adhere to that movement, but they believe in the concept that their lives matter. I believe in the concept, without adhering to that movement, that Black Lives Matter. I want to hear more people saying it. I want to hear more people saying it with pride and with serenity and not with anguish and desperation. And I believe that leadership was lacking from our first Black president, from our eloquent and attorney president. Let's remember, he's a trained attorney, just like as he and his wife, as officers of the court. It always behooves us to foster respect for the law courts and for police officers, and he needed to reach out as the commander-in-chief and as an attorney to the police officers in his community, white, Black, and Latino. You know, there are Black police officers, Latino police officers who are hugely aggressive with other members of their own community.
Sure.
I want you to know,
of course,
because I watched it in my own life. And he's got to reach out to that community, the professionals, and say, I want to lead you into greater respect for your communities. And I want to provide federal funding to ensure that all officers have the opportunity to be adequately trained to respond to the needs of their communities. It's up to the police officer, the adult on the scene, to restore, to restore calm, to bring peace to people who are quarreling, to apprehend suspects.
We do this. This is a sliver what we're seeing, these shootings.
You're
this
not,
happens every
but
day.
a leader is supposed to come say the things I say. In this community, in my role as a lawyer and a public figure in our local little community, I often say things like this that I think are very important. I'll even stand up and I say, talk in the community, it's important to pay your taxes. Why do I say silly things like that? People know that because when you're a leader, you're supposed to remind people what good behavior is, and you're supposed to remind people of the importance of having pride in being a good citizen. And my only complaint, my only fantasy with President Obama after 8 years in office, you didn't have the most stalwart record on foreign policy. You were there during these horrendous domestic crises.
He also deported more illegals than the Bush administration ever did, when we're talking about minority interests. Go on.
Well, you want to diss him for other issues, that's awesome. I think we have a shameful record in Canada, too, about deporting a lot of Latinos who were law-abiding, non-rapists, non-criminals.
Thank you, Harper.
Who paid taxes into the system and got no benefits and were thrown out of this country unceremoniously and were poorer for it. Thank you, President Harper. That's funny. Thank you, Prime Minister Harper, a Prime Minister I love and voted for, but who had a few antediluvian ideas about immigration that he unfortunately shared with the lunatic south of the border, El Donald. So before we point fingers at Americans, remember, we don't have the greatest record on immigration either. But for all the things Obama didn't do, he came into the office on the promise of hope and change. He came into office with tears of joy for members of the different Black communities who helped bring him into power. And I just don't feel he delivered. I don't feel he used the bully pulpit effectively enough to deliver and to speak to that brotherhood of police officers, to speak to the good hearts of the grand majority of police officers, and to bring them more tools, more arms, more ability to deal with their communities and avoid the repetitions of these tragedies.
I'd like to end on a micro level, and I'll turn to Dr. Samantha. While we wait for all this big policy to come and how to eventually change racial attitudes both in America and here, what kind of micro things can individuals do to sort of, it's kind of a cliche, but to check their own privilege and to be more sympathetic to their fellow countrymen who have not benefited from the same privileges as we do?
I think that's a really great question, and I think the number one thing is, frankly, awareness. I think you can't do anything without being aware and without being willing to admit that you may be wrong, or that there's things that you may be doing that are harmful in effect, even if that's not your explicit intention. And I think where a lot of people get stuck is when it comes to discussions of racism, particularly white people or white-looking people get stuck in the, well, I'm not a racist, because it's become a taboo term to say racist. And frankly, Daniel and I have gotten to a lot of discussions about this. I don't think it's really relevant whether you think you're a racist or not, or what your, and your intentions, they matter to an extent, but what's more important is really paying attention to what are the consequences of your actions. And even if you're walking in as an individual, as a teacher, as a police officer, as a lawyer, as just a regular citizen walking down the street, even if you're walking in with the best intentions and you see, and other people are telling you that what you're doing is having a negative effect on them and is hurting them or having them feel marginalized or isolated, I think it really behooves each and every one of us to really, before just saying and getting into the defensive and saying, well, that wasn't my intent, or I'm not a racist, or you're overreacting, or hey, you're not so perfect yourself, is to really pause for a second and think and just say, maybe what other people are telling me reflects their experiences. And maybe, just maybe, people know their own experiences better than I know their own experiences. And maybe, just maybe, even if j'ai pas fait exprès, even if I didn't do it on purpose, and even if I don't want to identify as a racist, maybe my actions are still contributing and are causing some sort of problem. And I think that's really the first thing that we need to do. If we see a group, for example, of black teenagers walking down the street, and our first reaction is to hold our purse a little closer and cross the street, it behooves us to notice that and just to say, wait a minute, is that okay? Why am I doing this? And just, I think it would go really, really far to just have a little bit of introspection. Instead of pointing the finger at America or at police officers or at whoever it is or at the government, to say, wait a minute, what about me? And what's my contribution here?
Daniel and friends, have you guys ever had one of those moments where you look at yourself and you say, okay, I have to correct that behavior because I've been conditioned to be afraid of X, Y, Z?
100%. I was very, very young and impressionable when I saw what I saw traveling across Canada and looking and observing what was going on amongst Aboriginals living in white communities. Remember, I wasn't going on reserve. And growing up here as a young adult, it's only Montrealers who are going to understand my reference to the Diana bar. But when you went to the bar, which is heavily populated by Aboriginals, you could have 3 good bar fights in one evening. And I was just going there because I had, it's going to sound even funnier, a couple of Irish friends who I suppose also contributed to the 3 bar fights in an evening. And it was quite an education as a young person. And it certainly took a number of interactions in my 20s to recognize that what I had seen across this grand and glorious country was not everybody, right? Because you develop an impression of a community by what you observe. And it was almost surprising to recognize that not everybody was like passed out drunk every night.
I come at this as a libertarian, and it's difficult for me to embrace identity politics. I think I've already sort of signaled my automatic revulsion when these things come up. I don't like, even when my mother was getting into Zionism and this, and you were talking about, as Jews, we stood arm in arm with blacks during the civil rights movement. To me, that reeks of collective self-esteem. I was not there in the 60s with black folk when they were going through those things, and I'm not going to claim for myself the achievements of other people who just happen to be Jewish. I think that's anathema to what I perceive as an individual liberty and responsibility. Most things that happen to you in your life are your own fault if you're living in the West, for the most part. I don't think that everyone has their own issues.
If you're a white-looking person with money, I totally agree with you. Especially if you're male.
I just said I don't want to play the Jew card, but, we are the superstar minority of the 20th century. I think white people are not very good to us, might I remind you.
There's a reason that I said white-looking. Uh-huh. We can at least blend in.
But to be a bit more empathic, it's just a bit more complicated. To your point, Samantha, when it's important, I think, to just be mindful of other people's experiences in life, and it really comes down to the old adage, just treat others as you'd like to be treated. I don't think it really needs to get more complex than that. I've known poor people, rich people, white people, French people, and they all have different experiences they bring to the table, and it alerts me to a different universe. And that's an exciting thing, but it's still an individual narrative.
I'll have to just, one last little interjection. When you meet people who came out here, Vietnamese people, French speaking, coming from that former French colony, Vietnam, and people who came here, settled here, grew up, and started families here. After the fall of Saigon, you learned a different reality than from the original people you met, who were the Americans who settled here as draft dodgers, right? And it creates here it's a different perspective in terms of your political understanding of the Vietnam conflict. But I think that I think you're too quick to reject the fact and reality of tribal identities, and as a result, it might I hypothesize prevent you from being as open as you need to be to experiences where you learn other people's different cultural and ethnic experiences. And that the Vietnam experience is very specific because, of course, there's quite a large population of Vietnamese people here and who've experienced, well, now we're all older, right? It's their parents' generation, who've experienced huge suffering and what it took to survive their experiences as citizens there and come over here and start a new life.
This was a pretty intense discussion. Why don't we leave it, as we usually do at the end of the podcast, with your suggestions for further reading? What articles, what films, books, anything that enlightened your opinions on racism? Daniel, shall we begin with you?
You know, a great film that comes to mind is Fruitvale Station with Michael B. Jordan, true story of a black man who was shot on at a subway station by a police officer. And I thought the portrait of that man in that film, I thought was very delicate. And I thought it really fleshed out a lot of counter narratives, and a very elegant film. I think everyone should see it.
Samantha?
What I would suggest is actually an article by there's a Slate author that I really like his articles. I find they're really very thoughtful and very detailed and have a lot of very interesting content, and that's Jamel Bouie. And particularly in this context, there was an article he wrote in 2014 called "Reparations Are Owed," and I think that it's just it's a discussion about a book, an article in The Atlantic, The Case for Reparations. And I think that Jamel Bouie, he really did a fantastic job of really getting into the issue, discussing it. And I think that if we are going to acknowledge and really head forward our really shameful history of segregating and of racism in the States and in Canada and our treatment of the Indigenous communities, then it does beg the question of what do we do about it, and is there a case for reparations? And I think that it's a really interesting article and very thoughtful.
Good, I found the book I was looking for. How the Irish Became White by Noel Ignatieff, which on its surface talks about how the Irish who came to the United States at the absolute bottom of the socioeconomic stratum moved up the ladder, ergo became white and became accepted after being subject to terrific prejudice. But what's more interesting in the book, as I recollect, it's been a number of years since I read it, is when they touch upon the not so awesome relations between Irish American and African Americans. And I think it makes for some heady reading because we forget too easily how much intertribal hatred has existed in the United States and for how long. And again, let's keep in mind, the Irish are people who came to the United States and brought prejudice from the old country. We're not talking about the authors of slavery or the creators of slavery, right?
We'll link up to all these further reading notes at thegoldwaters.ca. Join us next time for another episode. You can listen to past episodes on the website, thegoldwaters.com. And join the conversation on Facebook or Twitter, #thegoldwaters. I'm Dan Delmar, and thank you, Goldwater.
Thanks, Dan.
So you enjoyed yourself?
I was doing that one. Oh, this is really good.
Provocateur.media